In this podcast, Eric McNulty talks about leading the future in crisis. So, stay tuned. So, welcome everyone to Work to Auto podcast. Today we have with us Eric McNulty. A brief bio. So, Eric serves as an associate director for the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative and the Harvard T.H. Chan Program for Healthcare Negotiation and Conflict Resolution, and is also an instructor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, a contributing editor and columnist at Strategy Plus Business magazine. He has written for Harvard Business Review, among many noted publications and websites. He is the co-author of the second edition of the Renegotiating Healthcare, Resolving Conflict to Build Collaboration. And today we'll also talk about his new baby, You Are It. So I think it'll be a fun conversation. So Eric, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Beautiful. So why don't we talk about your journey, like what brought it to this point, if your background, and walk us through that.
It's a long and twisted tale, but I'll give you the short version of it, which is that I, after graduating university, went into communication roles, primarily in the private sector, and began to learn a bit about business. Wound up working in Harvard Business Publishing, which is how I started writing for Harvard Business Review, and helped them start and lead a conference business. And which got me introduced me to a lot of different areas, from supply chain management, analytics, did a lot of work in that space, as well as strategy and management and more sort of mainstream business topics. And that was a great business, doing events worldwide. And you may recall, your viewers may recall, there was a small dip in the economy back in 2008, which is when the conference business went away because no one's spending money on travel and training. And it happened by coincidence. There are two gentlemen who I had hired as speakers were two of my current co-authors, Lenny Marcus and Barry Dorn, who were working at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And I have been working with them around electronic medical records and what were the barriers to implementation of technology in that space. I had lunch with them and we were just beginning discussing their current work, which was much more around crisis leadership. And they asked if I could help them write a book. And I said, I think I can probably do that. So I started working with them. We actually published one prior to this, which was Renegotiating Healthcare, Resolving Conflict to Build Collaboration. And this introduced me to the world of crisis leadership, of this notion of disaster response. And as someone who loves to learn, I've learned an awful lot. Again, having spent most of my time with people in the private sector, in the business world, all of a sudden I'm working with people like the Secret Service and FEMA and military organizations, and very service-oriented. Lots of really smart people doing interesting work, but a world I had not been exposed to before.
Interesting. And what brought you to this this idea of conflict resolution? Like what excited?
Well, it's again, that root was rooted in healthcare, where there is lots of conflict. Always there's lots of conflict, in part because there are differences there's clinical differences of how do I treat this versus that. There are the different interests of stakeholders, of patients, patient families, with their caregivers. There's the whole business end of it, of how do we pay for this. And certainly in the U.S., I mean, we have a unique system here, we're a profit-making system. So there's lots of battles over who does what, how do we pay for it, who has the authorization to do certain things. And the interesting thing to me was, while, again, in the business world that I was familiar with, there was sort of leadership over here and negotiation over there. They were thought of as two separate worlds.
Interesting point.
And actually, they're very much integrated. And I remember interviewing a CEO from one of the hospitals here in Boston as part of the process of writing that first book. And he said to me, any interaction you have with another human being with a desired outcome is essentially a negotiation. Whether that's your subordinate, your spouse, your child, your board, whoever it happens to be, if you have an interaction with someone and you have a desired outcome, you're essentially negotiating something. So you're negotiating all day long. And I think that's one of the things that makes this book different, our work different, is that, I don't want to say by accident, but it was because of the roots from whence it came, that negotiation and conflict resolution mindset is baked into how we think about things. So it's a lot about framing things as problem solving. How do you get people to see each other's perspectives? How do you create unity of effort? that all comes out of the negotiation space. And so it's very much woven into how we just think about leadership.
Interesting. And explain us what your typical day looks like.
If only I had 2 days that looked the same. Which is one of the things I really like about my job. Is so I write, I research, I teach, do a lot of mentoring of students, and that happens both here in Cambridge at the Harvard campus, but I also do a lot of travel worldwide. I do a lot of work both in custom exec ed programs as well as speaking and things. And so I get to meet lots of interesting people, which is part of what keeps me going. Constantly learning more, bringing things in, finding out how different people approach their situations. So I will do, in any given day, I probably spend a couple of hours reading, and that's a broad range of things. I will very often write things. Writing helps me process things. And then I'll be having conversations, be it with students, with colleagues, with others. And then, June is probably my busiest month of the year. I'll teach 2 exec ed programs at Harvard. We'll do a week of media appearances around the book launch. And then shortly thereafter, I'm off to Singapore to do some work there over the summer. So it's never a dull moment.
That's fun. So let's talk about You're It. And full disclosure, I didn't get a chance to read the book. I will. I promise you that. So tell us the premise. Why this book? Like what this book?
So the reason we decided to write a book, this is more than 15 years of work baked into it. And what we had come up with, and our work is, we're in an academic institution and there's academic rigor behind it, but it's very much field-based. So whenever we are doing our research, we're trying to be in the field, sitting with executives, with leaders, when they're making decisions, when they're taking action, to learn what works and what doesn't in a really high-pressure environment. And so I went to the Gulf during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, for example. I was in New York and New Jersey after Sandy, here in Boston after the marathon bombings, and other interviews. And we came up with a set of core principles that people told us actually were really useful. I don't mean that in a bragging way, but what we have in You're It, what we call our meta leadership framework, is exactly that. It's a framework on which helps you organize both what you've learned academically, your work experience, your education. So you're a big Jim Collins fan, great. This is a way of looking at that and helping organize it with other things you've gotten. Or if you're in analytics, you're a big Tom Davenport fan, well, this is a way to think about that as well. And so when we realized that you can only reach so many people through classroom experiences, no matter how many lectures you give, no matter how many frequent flyer miles you accumulate, there's only so many people you can reach. And that we had gotten to the point where we thought a book would help get it out to a broader audience, get it in the hands of people. Because again, we're looking at leading through crisis and change, which I think describes a lot of people's world these days. If we can help them do their job a little bit better, navigate things a little more sure-footedly, that's just good for everyone. So let's get these tools out there as broadly as we can and try and hopefully have a positive impact on people.
Interesting. Very fair point. So from your perspective, what exactly is a crisis? How do you define a crisis?
So we look at a crisis as any incident that could affect your reputation, your share price if you're a public company, or your ability to operate. So it's not a routine emergency. It's not just that the fender bender, as it were. It's what is that thing that's really going to affect your company, your organization, its ability to operate, or the way the public perceives you over the long haul.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. And what? How does the leadership change when it comes to when I'm in crisis or whether I'm not in crisis?
That's a really interesting question, and I think the answer we came up with is a bit counterintuitive, because we started out thinking that there's sort of day-to-day leadership and then there's crisis leadership, and this is dramatically different. What it turns out, actually, it isn't. It's not in that In a crisis, you play at a much higher level because the stakes are higher,
Hmm.
but the core skills aren't that different, or at least the things that help you in crisis help you every day as well. So when you think about high emotional intelligence, the ability to make decisions amidst ambiguity, to communicate clearly and get people moving in the same direction, those are the things that are good in every day in most organizations. People still have a hard time with them, unfortunately,
Hmm.
many times. But those are the things that are absolutely essential in crisis. It isn't that you have necessarily the person who is the bravest or the smartest. Often it's the person who knows how to ask really smart questions and to engage people and get them moving in the same direction, to be able to sense the emotional temperature of a room and what you need to do uh, to diffuse tension sometimes, or to overcome objections, get people moving. And so the crisis leader who is really effective is really good at those things. So it's almost, if you
Hmm.
think of a professional athlete versus an amateur athlete who just
Hmm.
does something on the weekend. Often they're using the similar equipment. They're playing with similar rules. They may even be playing in the same physical dimensions of a court or a field,
Hmm.
but the professionals do it at a much higher level. And that's where the great crisis leaders come in. So you look at your golfing stars, whatever your favorite sport happens to be. I'm thinking recently of Tiger Woods and his
Hmm.
comeback. You know, Tiger plays the same game that people are playing, around the corner from your studio on the weekends, but there's a big jump in their capability, their capacity.
Interesting. Very interesting point. So, in from your vantage point, in your research, where have you seen, like, what are some of the qualities that a leaders carry that makes them a great crisis leader?
And again, this is a bit counterintuitive. One of the things that jumps to mind right away is that they tend to be really good listeners.
Hmm.
Because again, when we
Hmm.
think about, we use this framework called meta leadership,
Hmm.
and there are three dimensions to it. The first dimension is you, the person. Who are you as an individual? What is your education, your expertise? What's your emotional temperament? To knowing yourself and what you bring. But the second dimension is the context, the situation in which you're leading, knowing what's really going on, so therefore you can know what to do about it. And then building connectivity, the third dimension, is connecting the right organizational entities and individuals to be able to tackle the problem at hand. When you're a really good listener, you can find out what's going on with other people.
Hmm.
You get a sense of the situation, and then you can begin to build that connectivity. But if you aren't open to listening, you just come in telling mode, you
Hmm.
often miss a lot of the data. You miss a lot of the significance. You don't see the patterns of what's emerging.
Hmm.
And so we find that they're listeners. They ask a lot of really good questions. They're very curious and never afraid. Again, I've been with people who are very senior in their careers, very accomplished, still not afraid to ask. So
Hmm.
what am I missing here? Or what's really going on? What do you see? Turning to a more junior person and saying, what are you seeing going on here? They're always gathering information, and then there's the ability to maintain calm in a high pressure situation. Again, it's for the emotional intelligence, to be able to regulate
Hmm.
your emotions. Often it's understanding that when you're in a crisis situation, rarely is it personal. Now, if you've done something bad, it may be personal. But
Hmm.
if you're just the senior vice president at Acme Analytics, let's say,
Right.
and something goes wrong and people are yelling at you, they're not yelling at you.
Right.
They're yelling at the person who happens to have your job.
Right.
And being able to create that distance and then regulate your emotions so um, you're not overly reactive, but you can say, okay, I can understand why that person's upset. I can understand how we're going to try and solve the problem. Let me tone the emotions down a bit. That ability is really powerful and really critical to being able to lead through a crisis.
Interesting. And in your research, what are some of the interesting areas where some of the pitfalls that leaders fall into when they sort of tackling a crisis situation? What are some of the things where you see that some of the common pitfalls that leaders find themselves into?
There are several, and the first of which is to fail to get themselves out of panic mode, or what we would call the
Hmm.
emotional basement,
Hmm.
because we as humans,
Hmm.
we're hardwired to react to threat. We have what's called a triple F, the freeze, flight, fight
Hmm.
response. It's common to all humans, all mammals. actually all animals, I believe.
Hmm.
And it's a basic survival mechanism. It's how and whether that is a threat is gunshots or someone cuts you off on the highway. When your brain senses threat, it has this survival reaction. It puts you in panic mode to keep you alive. That's your brain's primary job. Knowing that's going to happen, you have to know how to get yourself out, which you can do through demonstrating any kind of self-competence. So knowing what to do, it could be a practice routine or a protocol. It could just be some deep breathing. Take 3 deep breaths, count to 10. I know my grandmother always said, when you're angry at someone, count to 10 before you say anything. And I didn't realize my grandmother was a neuroscientist, but apparently she was because she understood how this worked. But it's one of the pitfalls, and I've seen very accomplished people with lots of experience who were, when they confronted with a novel threat, they went into this panic mode and they just did not know how to get themselves out. And so when you don't, you are not reasoning very well. You are not controlling your emotions. You're not interacting with people in a productive manner. So you can get stuck. Again, we call it being in the basement. You can get stuck there, and good things are not going to happen because you're just not in the right frame of mind. So that's certainly one. A second one that we've seen is becoming a single point of failure. So feeling like, okay, I'm in charge. I'm the boss. This crisis, I have to resolve it, not we. So I'm going to make every decision. So I'm going to want everything to go through me. And when you do all that, you create a bottleneck. And whereas the really good crisis leaders say, okay, I know which decisions, I've figured out which decisions only I can make. The other ones, I want to make sure they're delegated and the people with the right expertise, they're making them and things are happening. So you don't want to suck everything up into the middle. You actually want to push a lot out. So you may say, okay, that decision to evacuate our facility, yes, I'm going to make that one. But all these other ones leading up to it, I want the right people. And if you've got a strong team around you doing their jobs, they're getting that ready. So when the decision comes, you know what you need to know. You can make that decision with some confidence. So if you're a single point of failure, that's another place that people can fall down. And then the other one, somewhat related to that, is people can tend to isolate. They get into their war room and they sort of close things off, or they go into their office, close the door, and say, "Let me think about things." And yes, if you need to do that for a few minutes, that's fine. But you need to be connected to the rest of your team, and then perhaps outside experts, your customers, your suppliers. What else is going on in this crisis? And if you're locked away, again, in an office or a war room, not getting that information, the event is moving and your thinking is not. So you're not keeping up with the evolution of the crisis. So it's important to know, yes, take some quiet time for you to think about something, but know that's a very intentional choice. I'll be back to you in 10 minutes. I'm going to go think about this. As opposed to some people who just go in, they close the door, and you don't see them for hours, and people then become afraid to come in and talk to them. So those are 3 big ones: of being isolated, becoming a single point of failure, or failing to get out of the basement.
Interesting. Wow. Good to know. I think so. One conversation I was thinking about when we were talking, that one of the major telecoms senior executive, and he was telling me, Vishal, my strategy is you should always outsource crisis, right? So you should pull yourself out of it, right? Just outsource, because we are very hackable human being. We are emotional. We are many times we find ourselves into interesting pitfalls that we have never experienced before. Now, from your vantage point, like how accurate his thinking, or what's your take on this?
Well, I think that's an interesting perspective. I think that there are, well, first of all, let me say, you want to be as intentional as possible about as many choices as possible. So there are things you may want to outsource. And I can certainly see where, yes, we need outside counsel because there are legal issues here that are beyond what our in-house counsel is used to dealing with. Or we need more communications capability. So we're going to outsource. We're going to set up a customer hotline, let's say. And great, there are companies that do that, and you can give them a script and you can begin to get that going. You may also want to have, and I think it's a very good idea to have a team of people who you can count on, but who are one step removed, so you can bounce things off of them. Sort of a team B, as it were. So you can say, we're thinking about doing X, make the counter case. And those, again, could be internal people, but often the outside people, you can, if you've, it could be, I don't want to say friends, but certainly peers, or it could be alumni from the company, people who know you well enough and who are loyal, but who are a little bit one step removed, so they aren't quite as emotional. But in the end, I think there are going to be decisions you have to make that are going to affect the future of your company. So I don't see how you can outsource those. I think you've got to say, okay, this is going to affect us for the long term. We've got to live with it. You can't outsource those things. Otherwise, you lose control and you just say, let's see what happens.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. That's a fair point. And one more conversation I was thinking about. So I was discussing this book, Extreme Leadership. You must have heard of.
Yes.
So I was talking to one of the executive about this idea of that in sort of in war areas, typically general they simulate a lot of war situations, so they don't when they are seeing one, they're not going to the 3F response. They have sort of a very methodical way or rational way to deal with those situations. And this this guy, he told me that you know what, but we can't simulate everything else, right? So his perspective was, okay, I have a routine way of doing business, but then for me, crisis is everything, like anything that could go wrong, right? And with some skill and magnitude. So how if I'm a leader, what would a leader do to prepare themselves to be sane and rational when they end up getting into these crisis situations?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, and crises are essentially problems to be solved. And so framing it in that way can help.
Interesting.
One of the people we interviewed for the book was the head of a investment bank in New York, and we were talking to him originally because his firm lost a number of people on 9/11, and we wanted to learn about that, and which I won't tell that story. But afterwards, he gave me a tour of the trading floor. The first time I'd been on an investment bank trading floor, and it was a sea of people with multiple computer screens and multiple telephones, and it seemed sort of chaotic. And I turned to him and I said, how do you manage this? Because this is going 24/7, instant decisions. And he said, rule number one, bad news finds me fast. He said, if I know about a problem, I can help solve it. He said, you'll never get fired here for making an honest mistake, but you'll get fired in a heartbeat for trying to cover one up and solve it yourself.
Wow.
And so there's one way. First of all, it helps prevent small emergencies from becoming crises, because if you find out about it quickly and you start solving it, you can mitigate some of the risk and you begin to take action early. Secondly, when you create an environment where people are not afraid to tell truth to power and come to you and say, uh-oh, this doesn't look good, boss, it puts you in a place where you can help solve it, and it doesn't become adversarial. It becomes, okay, something happened, let's figure out what we're going to do about it. And then at a sort of more mundane level, I had a person who used to work for me, a young woman, and she was running operations when I was running that conference business I mentioned earlier. And invariably, you're at a live event, something goes wrong. A speaker doesn't show up, the AV doesn't work, and people would begin to panic. And she would always say, okay, is anyone bleeding from the head? Would stop everybody. She'd say, because if they are, I know who to call. And if they're not, we can figure this out. So it framed it in a way of, so here's the extreme thing. Okay, is anybody going to die? No. Okay, if nobody's going to die, then we can figure this out. Everybody just take a step back and relax a little bit. And I think it's really helpful to be able to get people out of the, oh no, what's going wrong, to here's a problem, let's solve it. Okay, do we have everybody here? We need to solve it. Do we need to get somebody else involved? We need more expertise. We need more perspective. But you get them in that mode and get them doing little things they know how to do to start moving the process forward. Everyone calms down, and then you can help. You can begin to solve it. So I think, again, and I've talked with and been with many people who've had to make life and death decisions. And often it is just that sort of deep breath, okay, what are my options? What are we going to do? And it is looking at that as a problem to solve that puts it in a different place. Because you're right, you're the person you interviewed is correct. there's the things we know how to do, the sort of everyday business, and that's nice. But in a turbulent world in which we live, in a world with a lot of technology change and other things, other change afoot, you often are hit with things you haven't seen before. So you've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, which can be difficult. But again, if you're a real problem solver, which I think is a critical skill these days, and certainly going forward, that becomes a challenge, not something you're to be afraid of.
Interesting. I think you give a very interesting point. So common purpose, right? Giving them a common purpose.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the tips or tricks you could share? Because I think one thing that definitely we all have seen, if the larger a company, the more sort of discrete and random the people are working and use cases, and it's very difficult to give these tens of or hundreds of thousands of workers a common purpose that unite them, or basically give them this Swami leadership kind of a concept. So what are some of your strategies that you have seen, or something you could share?
Well, I think, yeah, and you're exactly right, because they're doing their everyday job. They're all over the, maybe geographically located all over the place. They're different parts of the business, and you may even have many different streams of business within a single organization. So it is tough to keep them unified. However, what I have seen work is to have very strong common values and operating principles. And by that I mean, so I'll give an example of one large company work with in the energy business. So they have, again, lots of different streams of business, but they're in the energy sector. And the common framework they use is prioritizing. It's people, environment, assets. And if you're in a situation, whatever it happens to be, and you've got to make decisions, you prioritize people, then the environment, and then the business assets. And if you do that, they will support you. So they may not know exactly what the problem is you were facing, but when you look at it afterwards and say, I made this decision because here's the evidence I had, and I was prioritizing taking care of the people, then they will back you up. And that very simple framework gives people something to say, okay, I know what to hold on to, even when things seem chaotic. I've got it. That's our common orientation. There's a bank in the UK called Metro Bank, and one of the operating principles they have that I love is called 1 to say yes, 2 to say no. So whenever a customer asks for something, if you want to say yes, you're empowered to do so. If you think you need to say no, you go have to find someone else to double check you. Whereas in most organizations, it's 1 to say no and 2 to say yes.
Wow.
And so there's one, again, a very customer orientation. And so it helps people. Again, you don't want that common purpose to be so cumbersome that people are afraid to act. But it often is, okay, we take care of our customer. We will never act in the against the interest of our customer. That may be one you have. Okay, that helps you. If you're the frontline customer service rep at 2:00 in the morning in a call center, that guides you. If you're the senior vice president making a big strategic decision, that guides you. That's how you create commonality. That's what pulls things together. People know they know what they stand for. They know what the priorities are and what the values are of the organization. Because I think the thing where companies go wrong, we've seen a lot of scandals recently, is it's really easy to try and create unity of purpose around share price.
Right.
Okay, what are the quarterly results? And that's great. I don't want to suggest they're unimportant.
Right.
But if people start making bad decisions because that they think is the ultimate way they're going to be judged, then you get people who cut corners or who fake data or who open accounts for customers without asking them, because that's the one thing they see that's driving everything is that financial result. You need that financial result to be matched by things that keep you customer focused, keep you quality focused, so that the organization stays on track and yes, achieves its financial goals, absolutely, but not, you don't want to wind up frittering away those financial gains in lawsuits and regulatory fines and all the rest.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. I think one thing that I'm definitely curious to have your perspective on, and you have a beautiful, definitely you would have a far better understanding of this than I do, is how do you know if you're in a panic mode? Like how do you know that? Because typically you are always behaving rationally, whether you're killing someone somehow. So how, like, what from your point of view, what are some of the like some of the thinking that okay, these are checkpoints. If I'm hitting those, maybe I'm going
The
extreme.
well, and actually, I want to challenge you a bit, and I think that the
Hmm.
research shows that we as humans are less rational than we think we are,
I agree.
and we are less our thinking is less conscious than we think it is. And the work of Daniel Kahneman is very good here. It's a
Hmm.
great
Hmm.
book I recommend a lot called Thinking Fast and
You're
Slow.
right.
You may have
Right.
read it.
Yep.
Really good at understanding how your brain works, and so that panic reaction it happens to all of us every day.
Hmm.
Someone cuts you off on the highway. Do you calmly say, "What a rude driver that was"? No,
Hmm.
you beep the horn, you may
Hmm.
yell, you feel your breathing quicken, your heartbeat quickens a bit. That's a sign it's happening.
Hmm.
You're getting ready for work, and you open your wallet, you find out your significant other did an unannounced loan program. Again, you don't react
Hmm.
calmly. You begin you can sort of feel yourself. Your sweat glands activate.
Hmm.
Once you get used to noticing it, you'll notice it all the time. And even people who are highly trained, I work with a lot of law enforcement officers, when they hear gunfire, they will go into that panic mode, but they will come out within a second because they know what to do. They have been trained. So they hear that trigger and they've got a trigger script and they know they may go for weapon or radio, whatever it is, but they move toward things. And so what I teach people is to three deep breaths is the one I use, and I think it works really well. Because if you become conscious of this, say,
Hmm.
oh, I feel a different physical reaction to what's happening. Stop. Let's just take three deep breaths. That alone will reset and get you out of that panic mode because you're demonstrating self competence. Okay, I know how to breathe in. I know how to breathe out. I'm in control. That takes less than 30 seconds. So that kind of thing. But if you notice you're yelling,
Hmm.
if you notice you are slamming your fist or whatever, that probably means you're in panic mode. And how many productive conversations happen when you're yelling at people, whether
Right.
it's a coworker or your spouse or your kids or the neighbor, whoever it happens to be. That usually isn't the best way to move things forward. And so when you feel yourself going in that direction, stop, take those three deep breaths or count to 10. That will recenter you.
Interesting. And I think one thing that I have seen, and this is maybe personal to me, and I did get some of the feedbacks on this that many times you don't know that you're in a panic mode. Many times so sure slamming something,
Mm.
it's pretty evident, right? So you
Yeah.
have at least you know that things are going way overboard. But sometimes these are like the panics are very passive in nature, right? They are just brewing inside.
Yes.
Whether you are panicking for something that's about to
Mm.
happen or whatever is going on. So, is there any way that metaphysically, like you can figure out that okay, this is something going on?
Well, yeah, if you're not noticing your bodily reaction,
Right.
the thing that we have found helpful is to share this knowledge with people, with your family, with your coworkers,
Hmm.
particularly this knowledge around this language of the basement and the
Hmm.
fact that it's neurologically based.
Hmm.
This is a how we're hardwired as humans. So it's not
Hmm.
like you're being overreactive. I can't say you're being overreactive or you're being overly emotional. But
Right.
I say I think you're in the basement.
Hmm.
And having just someone tell you they think you're in the basement will make you think, maybe I'm in the basement. Let me get out of the basement. And so I remember during the Deepwater Horizon response, my colleague Lenny
Hmm.
and I were down there. It was the second day they had stood up the National Incident Command, and we were with one of the senior officers there, was in the book, who was the Deputy National Incident Commander. And we were on a call with a bunch of governors, and it wounded with some acrimonious exchanges. And when
Hmm.
the phone was hung up, Peter Neffinger is the gentleman in question. He was sort of gray in the face, and he turned, and Lenny said to him, "Peter, I think you're in the basement." He was like, "Oh yeah, and it's dark down here." But just giving you a way to talk about it,
Right.
it diffuses some of the emotion, and that alone brought him out of the basement.
Interesting.
Whereas the person on the other end of the phone, I know wasn't in the next meeting, but we heard about the next meeting. We stayed in the basement for a long time because nobody had to do that. But
Interesting.
it's one of these when we do these trainings, I always say to people, take some of these tools back, like the basement, and share them with your team, so you can say to each other, "I think you're in the basement," or "Boy, I feel like I'm in the basement," and having a way to talk about it is the first step to getting yourself out of it.
Interesting. And another perspective, right? So in some such a situation, we know that the crisis is going on. It's very evident. But the responses that we hear or we see are not at par with what would alleviate or at least get the sentiment across. From your vantage point, what is lacking there? Like what are the opportunities there? Like one example I can give you, the Flint scenario, right?
Yeah.
Flint, they are still struggling with getting water
Yes.
to drink, and people know they hide it. They did whatever, but still they know. So what's going on? Like, what's your take from your research that's causing, and we can just count many of such debacles where it's it doesn't went the right way.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you say has
So-
went wrong there, or in some situations?
So it's very, very, very common. The situation you mentioned is very common. And one of the things we often say is that you may not be able to prevent the first crisis.
Right.
There's a secondary and tertiary preventable crisis of a bungled response. So, okay, we find out there's lead in the water. Now, someone's going to pay for that. There's going to be some fact finding there to figure out what happened. However, if you react appropriately, you can diffuse that crisis. And first of all, it means expressing empathy. People often confuse expressing empathy with expressing guilt. So, telling people you understand their concern, that you are going to do whatever it takes to take care of it, that you're going to bring resources to bear and begin to show them that that's happening, that helps diffuse everything, and it helps keep the crisis from escalating. But often, because people are afraid of, oh, if I say anything that suggests that things aren't fine, that's going to put guilt on us, and we're going to, in the inevitable lawsuits and regulatory hearings, we're going to look bad. Well, no, you're going to look bad anyway. Let's stop that.
Right.
However, expressing empathy, helping to share their outrage a bit, it may be, because again, you want to find out, how did that water get there? Now, if decisions were made, and I think in this case they were, to take certain actions that resulted in that in lead winding up in the water, or we're seeing it now with Boeing, and we see it with other organizations.
Right.
You've got a real culture problem there, and that may have been a crisis that was brewing for a long time, and you didn't find out about it until things got really bad. Until all of a sudden you get, now the public finds out about it. Now you've got a news crew there looking at it. But that crisis had been brewing for a long time. And that's one of those things why I mentioned earlier the notion of having really solid values and principles, is that I would hope that any organization that's charged with safety, whatever it happens, whether it's safety of the water supply or safety of the aviation system, one of those core tenets ought to be, if there's something that looks like it's wrong, we need to find out about it quickly. So don't hide it. One of the things we learned from wildfire fighters that they train their crews to do is look for anomalies and report them up the chain of command quickly. So if a fire is behaving the way you expect it to, you keep following the protocols you've all rehearsed them. But firefighters, the front lines, are trained to notice when things are different than they expect to be. They expected them to see them. And they're trained, don't discount that. Let somebody know. So then you can figure out, is that just something that's a little different, but it's fine? Or does it portend something much worse happening? But I think what you have in so many of these situations is what was a slow burn crisis that nobody was noticing, but decisions were being made every day, saying this is okay, or I don't want to be the one who has to tell the boss the lead level's too high, because that's going to cost a lot of money, and so it perpetuates and perpetuates and perpetuates until everything blows up and becomes a major crisis. And so, it's one of the things again we try and teach people is, create a high signal to noise ratio in the feedback loops in your organization.
Right.
So that when there is something that someone notices, it gets up and don't punish the messenger. Think back to that investment banker. Bad news finds me fast. If there's a high lead level reading, or there is something looking, doesn't look quite right, it's better if people find out about it early and can take care of it than it continues to fester and becomes a major crisis later.
I think so. You raised a very interesting point, culture, right? So if a crisis hits, then I think some of the things, I think you rightly pointed out that some of the things were just brewing inside, and now it just all spurted out, and you realize it just became a toxic culture where just everyone is just playing a blame game rather than doing something about it. So from your vantage point, from your research, how to keep yourself in check, that whether because when the crisis hits, your entire reputation is at stake. Your culture will be very exposed to the public. Whether it's like Uber is another great example, right?
Yes.
So you never realize everything was good, but then something hits and you realize there's a lot more than what we have heard about. So how to keep if I'm an executive at any of these companies, how could I understand the culture? Because I've always seen yes faces all the time, and the support structure around me is making sure I'm always comfortable. So many times I don't even see those areas where things are brewing. So what are some of the things that you could suggest?
Well, one is to make sure that you are getting some feedback from the front lines and hearing it. So I happened to hear. I was watching a video yesterday to get ready to share with some people in one of our current programs. It's Unlearn by Barry O'Reilly. For those of you who might want to go watch it. And he was talking about the CEO of T-Mobile. When he first assumed the job, one of the first things he did was have a line in his office connected directly to the customer support line. Apparently, he spent 4 hours a day, up to 4 hours a day, just listening to customer calls.
Wow.
And that was how he learned what customers liked, what they didn't like, what they were struggling with, what they didn't understand, was actually listening to it. And I've been in many organizations where, the senior executives will begrudgingly go spend maybe a half a day once a year in a call center or on a retail floor or somewhere where they're actually interacting with customers. And it's like, oh, don't bother me with that. But finding a way that you're getting that, getting some direct feedback from the end user is one good way. And the second is to be open and asking about what's, do we think or do we know, as people are giving you their answers about what's going on. And if you know, so how do you know?
Interesting.
Do we have data behind this? What's looking in? One of my favorite examples here to a preventable crisis. Remember healthcare.gov? Dramatic failure.
Right.
And it turns out that because they were afraid of reporting they might miss a deadline, they skipped the testing. They skipped the beta test. Now, what website anywhere, from the most basic, lemonade stand up to a major government agency, has ever launched without a glitch? None ever.
True.
Right? None ever.
True.
So to think somehow everything's going to go right, and if you're at the very top of that chain, you've got to be asking yourself, so how are we testing, or what are we learning from our tests? What are we getting wrong? If nobody has an answer for you, and then when they give you that answer, celebrate them. Thank you. Very famous story of John Mullally, who took over as CEO of Ford. And his direct reports used to had a sort of basic traffic light schedule report, so green, yellow, red. Company was doing horribly. Everything in the reports was green. So he finally said, so who's not telling the truth? And Mark Fields, who wound up being the next CEO after Mullally, was the first person to come in, and his report actually had some greens and some yellows and some reds. And he said, thank God someone's finally telling me the truth. And so acknowledging you weren't going to get penalized for saying there are problems, but you're saying, okay, again, put problems on the table. We can try and solve them, but don't cover them up. So you've got to be, as the larger your organization, the more levels there are, the more intentional you need to be about making sure that those signals have got a way to reach you. And you've got to be reaching out. It could be walking around the facility. It could be listening to a call center, being out on the retail floor, whatever it happens to be. Being on your airplanes. just getting out there and interacting, so you get some direct feedback.
Interesting. Wow. So now let's spend a few minutes on your uh, why this title?
My baby?
Your baby. Why this title?
Because when you're leading in a crisis situation or through significant change, you are it. People are looking to you for direction, for guidance, for answers, sometimes for a moral center, sometimes for maybe outrage, or maybe people are looking at you and saying, okay, someone needs to be leading here, and they're thinking you're it, either because of your position, it could be because they know of your background, perhaps because of your personality. But in that moment when the leading needs to happen, you are it, and you've got to be able to make decisions, take action. And so we gave it that title, and afterwards, talking to some of the crisis leaders we had come to know well through our research, they said that's exactly it. I feel like, I admit I'm sitting here, it's kind of lonely, but I've got to do something. You can't run away from it. You can't hide from it. You've got to do something. So you're it, and knowing that you're in a you're it moment, we hope, and with some of the tools and techniques we share in the book, will equip you to not be afraid of it, but step up and say, okay, here's an opportunity to make a difference, to do a good thing, and you'll step into the role and do well.
Interesting. And who do you write this book for? Like, who is the ideal reader for this book?
So there's a range of audiences here, and certainly, again, through our work, we've dealt a lot with people in the public sector who are in, first responders and organizations like FEMA and the Coast Guard and various military organizations, but also corporate people. And one of the common job categories is health, safety, and environment, and that acronym changes a bit industry to industry. But there tend to be people in organizations who are in charge of that sort of physical safety and how do we keep things running, who will be the people who run the crisis management team when something's going on. But I think more broadly than that, and as we've done the research in the book, we have stories from social activists, we have stories from CEOs, we have stories from a number of people in different positions who face that you're at moment. We were able to, quite fortunate, to interview one of the survivors of the Parkland shootings from Florida, who was trapped in a classroom and unfortunately saw classmates die around her, and then turned that into a positive experience of how do I take that horror that I experienced and go out and try and create some change in the world. The world is not short of challenges that we face, major challenges that we face. So, we want the book to be fuel that inspires people and gives them pragmatic tools they can use to go out and tackle those challenges.
Interesting. And so if I read through the book, like what would my takeaway be? Like, what would you think that a reader would take away from this book?
What I hope you take away from it is that leader is not a merit badge. It's not a title. At least I believe it's behaviors, not titles. And so that if you think you are leading, you better look and see if anyone's following. And if they're not, you're not leading. I don't care how fancy your title is. But that also, as we've come to know and understand people better, we can predict what they're going to need, what they're going to look for in a leader. Again, they're going to go through that panic mode. They want somebody to help them get out, help them assess the situation to understand what's going on, have someone who can craft and model the kind of behaviors that will help the group of people come together and move toward that problem in a way that solves it and gets the best possible outcome.
Interesting. And from your vantage point and from your research, looking at the humanity, how we're evolving, how do you think we are faring as, say, crisis responders? Like, are we getting better at it? Are we getting worse at this? Are the crisis magnitude is different? Like, what are some of the things you could share that maybe pushes me to consider reading this book?
Well, I think that actually, as humans, as we get back to our basic humanity, we're pretty good at it. We're an inherently social species. We have evolved in a way that we know we are better. We're safer in groups. We have existed in groups for thousands of years, and we will come together in the face of adversity. It's actually another wonderful book. It's a few years old now, called Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit. And she looked at, from starting with the San Francisco earthquake at the beginning of the 20th century up through Katrina. And what she found through a whole range of disasters was that people did come together and take care of each other. Unfortunately, we're also really good at building impediments. And whether that be class-based fears, whether it be, certainly in organizations, we build lots of things that make it difficult to work together. We build these organizational silos and little fiefdoms, and our rewards and recognitions may not actually reward collaboration, but rather reward either individual achievement or my little team, not the greater good. And so I think we're just beginning to figure out how to build organizations in a way that we call it swarming, but it's this ability to move swiftly and in synchrony to take care of a problem and to both respect organizational boundaries when they serve the problem solving and be able to work across them when they are getting in the way. And so we've constructed most of our problems, and I think it's a lot of learned behaviors. Again, when you think about it, I don't know your full background, but it's somewhere around age 5 or 6 when they stop grading you and able to play well with others, and then you're competing against other people all the way through.
Right.
I do a lot of work with physicians, and they get baffled by this collaboration bit, and I say, yeah, of course you're baffled, because you were competing individually in secondary school to get into a good university. You were competing in university to get into the right medical school. You were competing in medical school to get in the right residency. You were competing in residency to get to the right permanent position. All the way through, it's been individual reward. And now you get to the end of the pipeline and we say, oh, collaborate. You're not trained that way. So we've got to get better at that.
Interesting. And what are some of the surprises that you uncovered while writing this book? Like some of the assumptions that were reversed or that you didn't see fall through when you were just doing research for this book?
Well, one of them, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, is that we started out thinking crisis leadership was very much different than everyday leadership, and we found that it isn't so much. It's at a higher level. But the other thing that I found really interesting was how some of the core stories were in this disaster response. So, Deepwater Horizon, or the Boston Marathon bombings, or Hurricane Katrina. And then when we began to talk to people in corporate settings, or we began to talk in nonprofit settings, or even one of my favorite stories in the book is we talked to the gentleman who was ultimately the final project manager on the renovation of the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, which was an incredibly complex project, having to keep one of the greatest museums in the world open while you almost doubled its square footage, and dealt with antiquities and rare artworks and everything from union electricians to craftspeople building certain cases who came from Italy who didn't speak a whole lot of English. And you had all these, and oh, by the way, the budget can't be exceeded. The deadline is firm. It's a very public project, so the mayor's looking at you and the board is looking at you. Really, really complex. You think, how does that fit into this? Well, a lot of the principles he used to lead through that were the same ones we saw in these other situations. There's a lot of commonality. And it does come back to understanding people, understanding the situation in which you and they are operating, and then how do you build this connectivity so we're working on the same team to solve the right problems together as opposed to fighting each other. And that, to me, was great to see that it came out in so many different sectors beyond what we originally were considering.
Interesting. And I think one thing that I'm still finding it slightly harder to wrap my head around. So when you are in crisis, right? So aren't things different than when things are stable and they're growing? So I think because you're saying, which makes sense in some ways, that okay, there's not much difference. Can you shed some more light on it? Like if I'm going through crisis, I'm behaving differently because I want to get out of it quickly, or no?
You are behaving at a different pace, and certainly, I think that the periods of stable growth are fewer and farther between than we think they are. Because again, technology is changing, your competitors are changing. We've got a lot of unrest geopolitically. We're beginning to see it in terms of climate. there are these big systemic changes going on. We now have 5 generations in the workforce, or five generations here, 4 generations in the workforce at least, with different expectations and different perspectives on what's going on. So the notion of change is fairly constant now, and crisis is just a big oscillation in the pace of change. So, I mean, yes, in ways there's more urgency to it. Stakes may seem higher, but I am hard pressed to think of any industry right now that is in a what you could really call stable growth. There's growth, but it tends to be fairly frenetic. It can be up and down. You have everyone has their favorite unicorns, but then you look and see, oops, all of a sudden Uber was the hot thing, and then maybe not so much anymore. You mentioned the telecom industry, where I spent some time there when I was younger. An industry with a lot of change, energy, a lot of change, healthcare, certainly a lot of change, even academia.
Right.
We look around, and there are a lot of small schools going out of business, larger schools struggling for money, and just what students want is different. The demands for multidisciplinary education is very different than the traditional way of leading in academia, which is very siloed, very discipline-based. And so it's, I guess what I would say is that you will not go wrong by having the skills to lead well in a crisis. They will serve you well every day. There may be some people who do okay in every day, but it's like, we're in baseball season here in Boston, so there's always a sports analogy. But the person who can catch the routine ground balls, yeah, anybody can catch routine ground balls. But it's a person who really can step up and do something dramatic when the situation demands it, who will get you to a championship team.
Interesting. So from your perspective, if I'm running a corporation of a decent mid to large cap size, do you think that a good organization, a good crisis mature organization, I would have a stable response to a stable process to deal with the crisis, or I would just deal with the crisis as part of my ops somehow? Like what would be
I think you should have. First of all, as we mentioned earlier, you want to have good sensors out there so you can catch things early, hopefully before they blossom into a real crisis. But then knowing that, and again, you may get hit with a hurricane, you may get an active shooter. There could be crises that hit you that aren't of your own making. So it's worth thinking about them. Have a team, a designated crisis management team. And that's not their full-time job, but they are trained and ready, because if a crisis hits, you want to know who's going to be doing what and how they're going to work together. And they best have practiced that a bit. So again, just that getting out of the panic mode. If we know what to do, the 3 deep breaths, well, if we know, convene the crisis team. Go to we've got a room that we set up that we have put the right telecommunications equipment and TVs and things in there to be ready to use it as a war room. Great, we know what to do there. That gets you into sort of what we call a battle rhythm to move forward. So I think every organization ought to have that. I think every board of directors ought to have some version of that, because again, you don't know if when Ebola popped up,
right?
Whose fault was that?
Right.
No one in particular, but all of a sudden it could plunge your company into a difficult situation. So measles now is popping up.
Right.
So be ready to handle that, and if they never have to actually handle a crisis, they only have to handle the occasional drill. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? They know each other. They know how to work together. They've thought through some processes, and they're better prepared. They're more confident should something hit. There's not a lot of downside there.
Interesting. And now, one thing I want to learn from you. So, if I am observing a crisis in action, right, and I'm in that organization, and I particularly don't like the response, nor I have substantial muscle to do something about it. Like, what would you recommend? What would you suggest that if I'm spectating, or I'm just looking through a crisis, and I want the leadership to have attention on this? What do you suggest?
So, I'll make sure I understand the question. So you're saying that you're an observer,
right?
But you have the ability to do something, and
You don't have ability to
you
do
don't,
it.
but you
Because
want.
you're slightly either low on the totem pole on this, or you are not in the cream of the cream where things are getting decided on. And we see a lot of. I can give you an example. During BlackBerry's
Mhm.
downfall days, right? I spoke to one of their product heads, and he said, Vishal, we can see it happening, but somehow we can't. We can't get our thoughts across. Like we can't get our points across to the organization, and like we start seeing some of those trends, but nothing, right? So, what would I tell this guy or this gal? What would they do?
So that's an interesting point you bring up, because I know in the research, and as a gentleman at Dartmouth, Sidney Finkelstein has done a lot of research into business failure.
Hmm.
And what he and his team found was that pretty much every single time the evidence of the impending failure was there, people failed to heed it, often because they're so busy making money off of what's working right now,
Right.
they're afraid to acknowledge that it's going to go away. And BlackBerry's a great example,
Right.
because for a while everybody had the BlackBerry, and then all of a sudden no one has a
No one's
BlackBerry.
agree, right?
Unless you're a government employee, in which case they still have them. But that's, captured market. So the things there are being able to surface the right metaphor is a great thing, is a way of getting people to pay attention to it, and/or the right stories. So again, it's related to telecom. One of the things you can say is this our iPhone moment? And someone will say, what do you mean? I say, well, actually, Nokia prototyped a smartphone several years before Apple did, and look what happened to Nokia. Are we? What do we have? If we're not constantly thinking about what's next, disrupting ourselves, someone's going to disrupt us. And being able to throw out an example that gets people talking is a good one. Another one that happened to come out of that video I was watching last evening by Barry O'Reilly was, as researchers going into why did the Roman Empire persist for 2,000 years? And one of the really key things they found was that the Romans were not overly wedded to their way of doing things. When they found something better, they get rid of what they were doing and adopted the new method.
Beautiful.
To do that. And I think it's incumbent on people farther up in the organization to be asking people who are further down, so what are you seeing? What's happening here? And give them a voice in. Because first of all, it gets them really engaged in work. But all of a sudden, they may see things that you don't. And one of the stories, and this is not disaster related at all, but early in my career, I worked at Bloomingdale's in New York. I was in public relations. And the art director at the time, the creative director, was a guy named John Jay. Was a legendary. So, wrote books, won lots of awards, still working out on the West Coast at this point. But he is so he's of a legend in that world. And I'm walking down the hall one day, and he says, "Eric, come in here." And he was working on a new design for some shopping bag. He says, "What did you what do you think about this? How does this hit you?" I'm like a 24-year-old kid who knows nothing. And here's this world-class art director calls me in and says, "So what do you think?"
Interesting.
First of all, it shows him that he was open enough and smart enough to say, "Yeah, I'm really good, but I don't know everything. So let me get some other perspective in here," which was good. And for me, I thought I worshipped the guy from then on, because again, here I'm a 24-year-old kid who doesn't know nothing, doesn't know anything, and I'm being asked my opinion. So, and then, as a leader, you've got to always be cultivating that frontline feedback to get there, because, what I tell people is always start with the assumption that no one has all of the answer, but everyone has part of the answer.
Interesting.
And if that's your perspective, you're always out trying to gather more pieces of the puzzle to put together. And, but I think, if you're further down, having that metaphor, that little intriguing thing you can throw out there, that makes it's a metaphor or an analogy to another situation that will get people to stop and say, "So what do you mean?" And then you can start talking, and then they start talking, and then it brings you into it.
Interesting. Wow. So that brings us to the end of the book, and I want to spend a few minutes on your journey before we part ways on this. So we ask all of our guests to share some of the qualities or some of the traits that has helped them stay successful or stay sane throughout their years. What are those qualities that you attribute your success to?
A couple. So one is that I, whether I was born this way or I can thank my parents, I'm happily thank my parents.
Hmm.
I love to learn. I read a lot. I love talking to different people. One of the little mottos I have, and I always keep with me to remind myself, is that quality output requires 3 to 5 times quality input.
Hmm.
So that 'cause I'm out teaching a lot, I'm speaking a lot, I'm doing interviews like this, it can be
Hmm.
really easy to think, oh, I've got, just keep stay in
Right.
output mode.
Right.
Well, the output gets pretty stale as you're doing a lot of input. So that
Right.
and in times like these that are very turbulent, the ability to keep learning and keep challenging yourself is really critical. I'm also grateful, in retrospect, that I was laid off fairly early in my career.
Hmm.
It happened. The first time it happened was probably 30 years ago. It was the same week I bought my first house. We were newly married. We
Wow.
bought our first house, assuming a mortgage, and I get laid off.
Oh my.
Um, but what it taught me was, okay, I fell down, I picked myself up, I started doing freelance work, and then eventually I got another job. I said, okay, I will survive this. And so that gave me the attitude going forward of, so what are they going to do? The worst they can do is throw me out of the room, throw me out of the building, right?
Hmm.
I will survive. I will pick myself up. I've got skills. I will figure this out. And so that to me has been really helpful because again, I don't get terribly afraid of telling people the truth because what's the worst they can do is fire me,
Hmm.
and that won't be the end of my life. So those two things, and then just being open to making relationships. I have been fortunate to meet a lot of people over my career. I have made a lot of relationships, and at the time you may think, I have no idea what we're going to do together eventually or what we have in common, but that's an interesting person. You hang on to that contact, and then 5 years later,
Hmm.
it turns out that you either connect, you can help put you in touch with somebody else, or you've got a question or things, and building those relationships is really critical. I think people ought to be attuned to that and continually build them over their career.
Interesting. And another question we ask all of our guests to share are some of their favorite reads besides this book,
It's the best
that
book.
you all should check out. And I'll put the links for our listeners and viewers, so they can download the book and they can buy the book. So, what are some of the books you could suggest that are some of the books that you love reading, your favorites, or whichever you want to share?
Um, I've mentioned a couple here in the interview, and I'll reiterate them because I think they're important. In terms of how our brains work,
Hmm.
I think Thinking Fast and Slow by
Hmm.
Dan Kahneman is the best book out there. It's about
Hmm.
4 or 5 years old now, but it
Hmm.
really is worthwhile. Another one that I've enjoyed is called Leadership in the New Science, which is about 20 years old now, written by Margaret Wheatley. And she looked at how complexity theory and quantum physics helped inform thinking about how organizations work.
Hmm.
So I think that's a really good one. And I get a lot of inspiration on looking at organizations through how cities work. So a
Hmm.
classic, one that just turned 50 years old, I think it was last year, is The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
really talked about how neighborhoods work and how parks, how you really get environments that thrive. And if you thought more of our organizations in that way, I think we would have healthier organizations and much more dynamic organizations than we do now. So
Interesting. Interesting reads. So, as a last but not the least question, if you want our listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, or from what would that be? Like, what would be your closing remark to our listeners and viewers?
I would say that in life there are going to be moments when you're it, and it may
Hmm.
be a mega, corporate mega crisis, or it may just be something that happens in your neighborhood or in your family. These things happen to all of us, and so be thinking about that moment when you're it. What are you going to want to do? How are you going to want people to remember you and you remember yourself in that moment? And so prepare for understanding through understanding yourself, the people around you, so that you're ready when something happens. You're the one who can step up and say, "Yeah, I'm it, and I'm glad to be it."
Awesome. With that, thank you, Eric. I think
Thank
you
you.
are it, and you all are it. So do check out his book and leave your comments, on his book page, or on this podcast. And again, thank you everyone for um, spending time with us. Until next time, thank you and goodbye, and keep on learning. Bye bye.
Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the